The small town of Briarwood, in the heart of the United States, had its peculiarities, but among all the stories circulating there, Jamal's was one of the most talked about, even though, curiously, it was a well-kept secret. Jamal wasn't just the older brother of Sophia and Rachel. He was the man who controlled their lives, their decisions, their choices. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what motivated him, but everyone knew that his presence was undeniable, and the consequences of disobeying him devastating. He lived in a simple yet well-kept house. His eyes were unreadable, and his behavior unpredictable. At times, he seemed caring, while other times it was clear his only concern was control. He watched everything and everyone, but his attention always seemed to return to his sisters, Sophia and Rachel. Sophia, the youngest, was quiet, reserved, and always tried to please Jamal, but there was something about her that bothered him, a silent freedom that Jamal tried to stifle. Rachel, on the other hand, was more rebellious, bolder, always looking for ways to escape the invisible chains Jamal wrapped around her. However, the secret Jamal hid wasn't in his everyday actions. It was in his manipulation of others for a financial scheme. He, with cold and calculating precision, was behind a plan involving couples who wanted to adopt children. It wasn't just a game of control. There was a lot of money involved. He knew exactly how to use it to his advantage, turning his sisters into mere pawns on his chessboard. But of course, this wasn't something Jamal openly discussed. He had the skill to hide what he did, keeping the control at home, and making everything seem normal to the outside world. In town, people saw him as a family man, respected and quiet. But to Sophia and Rachel, the reality was quite different. Rachel especially felt the weight of Jamal's gaze constantly. There was something unbearable about being watched all the time, as if her life wasn't truly hers. She was tired of it, but no matter how hard she tried, she didn't know how to escape that prison, and Jamal knew this, using her vulnerability against her. One night, while they were all having dinner together, Rachel seemed uneasy. It wasn't that unusual, but Jamal's stare at her was more penetrating than ever. He didn't say anything, just observed, and that alone made her feel weak, powerless. She didn't know what was coming, but a part of her felt that their calm days were about to end. At the table, Jamal broke the silence with a simple question. "Have you thought about the future, Rachel?" He looked at her with a cold smile, but there was an invisible threat behind the question. Sophia glanced sideways, sensing the tension, but chose not to intervene. She knew that any wrong move could make things worse. Rachel took a deep breath and answered, trying to hide her discomfort. "Of course, Jamal, I have plans." But at the same time, a part of her knew that deep down, Jamal had complete control over her plans. After dinner, Rachel went to her room, her mind racing, unable to shake off the feeling of being suffocated by the walls around her. She thought about running away, finding some kind of freedom, but the chains were everywhere. In Jamal's words, in the lack of alternatives, in the fear. Jamal's story, with his manipulations and control, was just beginning to unfold, but something would change soon, and by doing so, it would put the lives of Rachel and her sister Sophia at risk. The game was about to change, and although Jamal seemed to be in control, the fate of the sisters was more complicated than he imagined. Sophia, as quiet as ever, felt the tension growing. She knew that somehow Jamal was pushing them into a dead end. But what she didn't know yet was that behind Jamal's facade of control, there was a secret that would change everything, a secret that even he was about to uncover. The days that followed were heavy with the same oppressive silence that Jamal liked to maintain at home. It was as though he was constantly observing his sisters, gauging their every move, and using their hesitations against them. It wasn't just physical control. His influence over them was psychological, and it ran deep. Sophia, always the passive one, tried her best to blend in, but Rachel, as always, felt the weight of Jamal's manipulation in her chest, like a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe. One afternoon, Rachel came home late. She had taken a walk to clear her head, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home. But as she opened the door, she was met by Jamal, who stood in the hallway, arms crossed, a grim expression on his face. "You were late," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. His eyes were sharp, calculating. There was something about his gaze that made her feel small, insignificant. But Rachel had had enough. She wasn't going to let him control her like this forever. "I needed some space," Rachel replied, her voice stronger than she intended. "I can't live in this cage forever." Jamal, his eyes narrowed, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something dark behind them. But then, as always, his mask of control returned. "Space?" He repeated the word mockingly, his voice cold. "You don't get space here. You live under my roof. You live by my rules." Rachel clenched her fists, fighting back the anger that was threatening to spill over. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the fear of what he might do kept her quiet. She knew that Jamal didn't take defiance lightly. He would retaliate, and it would be worse than she could imagine. "I know you're angry, Rachel," Jamal continued, his voice softening slightly. "But remember, everything I do is for you, for this family." Rachel wanted to argue, to tell him that everything he did was for himself, for his control over them, but she held her tongue. She knew it wouldn't change anything. In his eyes, they were his property, his rules. That evening, as Rachel lay in bed, she tried to sort through her emotions. The weight of her brother's control had become unbearable, but the thought of leaving was just as daunting. She didn't have anywhere to go, no one she could turn to. Jamal had isolated her from everyone else, and the only person she had left was Sophia, her sister, who was too scared to intervene. But things were about to change in ways neither of the sisters could have anticipated. The following week, Rachel discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her like a freight train, and for days she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone. Jamal would surely see it as a betrayal, a mistake that would ruin everything he had worked for. But she couldn't ignore it. She had to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. She spent several sleepless nights wrestling with the decision of whether or not to tell Jamal. The thought of his anger and punishment was overwhelming, but the fear of living in constant torment was just as suffocating. Finally, she decided to confide in Sophia. One evening, after Jamal had gone to bed, Rachel pulled her sister aside in the quiet of their small kitchen. Sophia was surprised by the solemn expression on Rachel's face. She could tell something was wrong, but she had no idea what. "I have to tell you something," Rachel said, her voice shaky. "I'm pregnant." Sophia's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly hid her surprise behind a veil of concern. "Rachel, what are you going to do?" Rachel shook her head, unable to answer. The truth was, she didn't know what to do. She didn't have any options, and the thought of telling Jamal terrified her. But she knew that Sophia would never understand unless she told her the full story. "There's more," Rachel continued, lowering her voice. "The baby, it's not Jamal's." Sophia's eyes grew even wider, the weight of her sister's words sinking in. "What do you mean? Who is the father?" Rachel hesitated, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "It's a man I met a while ago. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I'm not sure what to do now. Jamal will kill me if he finds out." Sophia was silent for a long moment, absorbing the revelation. This was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Jamal's control over their lives had always been suffocating, but this was something new, something even more dangerous. "You have to tell him," Sophia finally said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "You have to tell him before he finds out on his own." But Rachel knew better. Telling Jamal was not an option. It would be the end of everything for her. She had to find a way to protect herself and her unborn child from Jamal's wrath. But how? In the days that followed, Rachel began to see a way out. She had never wanted to rely on anyone, but the idea of telling the truth to Jamal wasn't an option. She would have to do something drastic, something that would shake the very foundations of the control he had over her life. Rachel wasn't sure what her next move would be, but one thing was certain. She couldn't live like this anymore. And Jamal's reign over their lives was about to be tested in ways he never saw coming. The days after Rachel's confession were full of tension. She could feel Sophia's concern growing with each passing moment. Her sister was torn between wanting to protect Rachel and being too afraid to go against Jamal. Rachel understood that. She had lived with that fear for as long as she could remember. But now, for the first time, there was something greater at stake than just their daily survival under Jamal's control. There was a life growing inside her, a future that couldn't be confined to the shadow of his tyranny. Jamal hadn't noticed the shift in Rachel at first. His attention was always focused on the bigger picture, maintaining control, manipulating situations, always planning his next move. But Rachel was no longer content to simply follow along. She had decided to take matters into her own hands. The first step was to create a plan. She couldn't just wait for things to happen. She had to make them happen on her terms. The idea of leaving was daunting, and she knew it would be a dangerous choice. Jamal would never let her go without a fight. But Rachel wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. She spent the next few days in secret, going through old records, searching for anything that might help her escape. She had nothing to her name, no money, no resources, but she had her wits, and that, she believed, was all she needed. As she sifted through the old papers in the attic, she found an old bank account statement, remnant of the life their parents had once lived before their untimely death. The account, though nearly empty, still had enough funds to give Rachel the small push she needed to escape. It was a risk, but one she was willing to take. The real challenge was getting out without Jamal noticing. He always kept a watchful eye on everything. But Rachel had learned a few things over the years. She knew how to slip past his radar, how to blend into the background. Now, all she had to do was wait for the right moment. Meanwhile, Sophia was becoming more and more concerned. She had heard Rachel's plans and while part of her wanted to help, another part of her was too terrified to act. Jamal had always been unpredictable, and she knew that crossing him would mean consequences, terrible consequences. Yet there was a part of Sophia that couldn't stand seeing her sister suffer. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her head down and did what Jamal asked. But Rachel's strength was beginning to awaken something inside her, a desire to stand up, to fight for herself and for her sister. One night after Jamal had gone to bed, Sophia and Rachel sat together in the dimly lit kitchen. Rachel was packing a small bag with the essentials clothes, a few personal items, and the bank statement she had found earlier. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she had to leave. She couldn't stay under Jamal's control for another day. "I can't do this anymore, Sophia," Rachel said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "I can't keep living like this." Sophia sat across from her, staring at her sister with wide eyes. She could see the pain in Rachel's face, the weight of her decision. It wasn't easy to leave Jamal. It was something that would tear their family apart, but it was something Rachel had to do for her own survival. And Sophia knew it. "I understand," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what if Jamal comes after you? What if he finds you?" Rachel paused, glancing at her sister. She saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else, something that made her believe that, deep down, Sophia wanted to help her. "I'll be careful," Rachel said. "I have a plan. I'll be all right." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then stood up. She walked over to Rachel and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She may not have had the strength to leave Jamal herself, but in that moment she gave her sister the strength she needed. "I'll cover for you," Sophia said quietly. "Just be careful." Rachel nodded, grateful for her sister's support, but she knew that this would be a battle she would have to fight alone. The next morning, just before dawn, Rachel slipped out of the house. Jamal was still asleep, and Sophia had promised to keep him distracted for as long as she could. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she quietly made her way out the door. The air was cold, and the streets were empty, but she didn't care. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. She caught a bus to the nearest city, using the small amount of money she had withdrawn from the bank account. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get her started. She didn't know where she would go from here, but she was determined to find a way out of the life that Jamal had forced on her. Days turned into weeks as Rachel tried to build a new life for herself. She found a small apartment, took on odd jobs, and began to settle into her new routine. It was hard, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her own life. But even as she moved forward, she couldn't shake the fear that Jamal would come looking for her. His reach was long, and his obsession with control knew no bounds. Every knock on the door, every shadow in the alley made her jump, wondering if it was him. Meanwhile, back at home, Jamal was beginning to realize something was wrong. Rachel hadn't come home, and Sophia's silence was deafening. He knew his sister too well to believe she had just run off without a reason. Something had happened, something that had pushed Rachel to the edge. He began his search, starting with the bus station, asking questions, searching for any sign of where Rachel had gone. But he wasn't the only one looking. Sophia, torn between loyalty to her brother and her sister, knew that Rachel was gone for good. and there was no telling how far Jamal would go to bring her back. The walls that had once seemed so solid were beginning to crack, and Rachel had no idea just how much of a storm she had unleashed by walking away. Rachel's new life, though hard, felt like a fresh start. Every day was a challenge, but with each new obstacle, she felt a little more in control of her own fate. The small apartment she had found, though modest, was a sanctuary. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She spent her days working odd jobs in a cafe, quietly slipping into the rhythm of the world outside Jamal's shadow. She was free, but the taste of freedom was bittersweet. Despite her relief, Rachel's mind was constantly occupied with the question that haunted her. How long would it take before Jamal found her? His persistence was a dangerous trait, one that had controlled her life for so long. She had managed to slip away for now, but she could feel the weight of his impending pursuit hanging over her. Meanwhile, Sophia, trapped in the house they once shared, was battling her own internal war. She had watched Rachel leave that night, and although she had promised to cover for her, a sense of guilt gnawed at her. She knew that Rachel couldn't escape forever, that Jamal would come looking for her, and when he did, Sophia would have to face the consequences of her silence. Jamal, for all his charisma and manipulative ways, was not blind. He knew something was off. His careful control over every aspect of their lives had been shattered in one impulsive decision: Rachel's escape. His fury was building, and his search was relentless. Where is she? He had asked Sophia for the third time that day. His voice was quiet, but the tension in the room made every word feel like a threat. Sophia stared blankly at the floor, afraid to speak, afraid to admit the truth. She had done everything she could to stall him, even making excuses for Rachel's sudden disappearance, but she couldn't keep up the charade forever. "I don't know, Jamal," Sophia lied. "She's probably just gone out to clear her head." Jamal's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her. There was something off in her voice, something that didn't match the usual submissive tone she always took with him. He stood, pacing in the small living room, clearly agitated. His eyes darted to the door, his thoughts racing. "No," he said slowly, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. "She's gone. She's left." Sophia's heart dropped. She had tried to keep him from discovering the truth, but it was inevitable. Jamal was too sharp, too methodical. He was starting to piece it all together. "Jamal, please," Sophia pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not what you think. She just needed space. We can fix this." Jamal turned sharply to face her, his eyes burning with rage. "Fix it?" His voice was low, threatening. "You've always been weak, Sophia. You never saw the bigger picture. I was trying to help you. Help both of you." Sophia flinched, but she couldn't look away. The man she had grown up with, the man she had always feared, was unraveling before her eyes. His grip on everything on them was slipping, and it terrified him. Rachel had been the key to his plans. She had always been the one who kept him grounded in his manipulative schemes. Without her, Jamal was lost. His obsession with control had blinded him to the possibility that his sisters could break free. But now, as Sophia saw the dark, twisted desperation in his eyes, she realized the danger wasn't just to Rachel. It was to all of them. Jamal's search grew more frantic as the days passed. He began asking around town, visiting places Rachel had frequented. He knew his sister too well to believe she had just disappeared without a trace. Her escape wasn't just a betrayal, it was a challenge to his authority, and that was something Jamal could not allow. As he made his way to the bus station one evening, something caught his eye. A woman sitting on a bench, her face familiar. It was Rachel. The shock hit him like a physical blow. There she was, sitting calmly, as if she hadn't just upended everything he had built. His blood boiled as he approached her. Rachel looked up as she heard the familiar voice. Jamal, her heart raced, but she stood her ground. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. It was now or never. "What are you doing here?" "Rachel?" Jamal asked, his tone cold but filled with that unmistakable edge of fury. "I'm leaving, Jamal," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. "I'm not going back. I'm done with you." Jamal's expression hardened. "You can't leave. You think you can just walk away and start over? You're nothing without me." Rachel took a step back, her hands trembling, but her resolve unwavering. "I don't need you anymore. I'm free, Jamal. I'm going to make my own life. I don't need your control, your manipulation, or your lies." Jamal's fists clenched, his face turning red with anger. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me? You don't understand, Rachel. You're nothing without me. You'll come back, just like you always do." But Rachel didn't flinch. She turned and began walking away, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of Jamal's control start to lift. Jamal stood there for a moment, watching her leave. His mind raced. This was his sister, the one who had always obeyed him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to lose her, but Rachel was already gone. She had taken that first step into freedom, and there was no turning back. Sophia had been waiting at home, torn between guilt and relief. She had feared this confrontation, but she knew it was inevitable. When Rachel walked in the door, she was visibly shaken but resolute. "She's gone, Sophia," Rachel said quietly, her voice full of a mixture of sadness and triumph. "It's over." But Sophia couldn't help but worry. She had seen the way Jamal reacted, the way he lost control. Rachel may have escaped for now, but she knew that Jamal wouldn't give up that easily. The fight was far from over. Rachel had hoped that walking away from Jamal would be enough to give her a fresh start. But as the days passed, it became clear that escape wasn't just about leaving physically. The scars, the manipulation, and the years of control were harder to shake off than she had imagined. Every corner of the city seemed to whisper reminders of Jamal's presence. She could still hear his voice, see his face in her nightmares. But the biggest weight on her shoulders was the looming question of what would happen next. She spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the small apartment suffocating her. Each time she closed her eyes, she could feel his presence, like a dark cloud hanging over her. Jamal wouldn't just let her go. He would come for her. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. Sophia, on the other hand, had returned to her normal life, though she couldn't shake the guilt that lingered like a shadow. She had lied to Jamal, told him everything was fine, even though she knew it wasn't. She could feel the weight of her betrayal every time she saw Rachel, but deep down she knew it was the right thing to do. Yet she had also come to realize that her own freedom was fragile. She lived in constant fear that Jamal would one day come to her, demanding answers, threatening her. She hadn't been strong enough to leave before, but now that Rachel had broken free, Sophia wondered if she could too, if it was possible for her to follow in Rachel's footsteps and carve her own path. But the thought terrified her. The days turned into weeks, and Rachel settled into a routine. She worked long hours at the cafe, making enough to cover her rent, her food, and the occasional moment of respite at the local bookstore. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She was learning to enjoy the simplicity of life, something she had never been allowed to do before. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. But that peace was shattered one cold evening when she got a call. "Hello?" She answered, her voice shaky, the number unfamiliar. "Rachel, it's me." "Sophia," came the voice, sounding desperate. "You need to come home. It's Jamal. He's not letting up. I don't know how much longer I can keep him off your trail." Rachel felt a chill go down her spine. She had been dreading this moment. "What do you mean, Sophia? What's happening?" "He's been asking around, Rachel. He's been telling people he's looking for you. He's getting more violent. I don't know what he'll do when he finds out where you are." Rachel felt a knot twist in her stomach. She had thought she was safe, but now it felt like the walls were closing in again. "Please," Sophia continued, "I need you to come back. You're not safe alone." Rachel's heart raced. She knew Sophia was trying to protect her, but the thought of going back to Jamal, to that house of pain and control, filled her with dread. "No, Sophia, I won't go back. I can't." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Sophia spoke again, her voice quieter. "I understand, but I don't know how much longer I can keep him away from you. You need to be careful, Rachel. He's capable of anything." Sophia's warning echoed in Rachel's mind as she hung up the phone. She had made a promise to herself that she wouldn't let Jamal control her anymore. But as she stared out the window of her apartment, she realized just how real the threat was. Jamal wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. The next day, Rachel decided to take action. She packed a bag with just the essentials: clothes, some cash, her ID, and left her apartment without looking back. She couldn't stay in one place for too long, not with Jamal hunting her down. She reached out to a few people she knew, friends she had made during her brief time in town. They offered her a place to stay, a temporary safe haven. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. But even as she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jamal was getting closer. She knew he would come for her, and when he did, she had to be ready. Meanwhile, Jamal's rage was building. He had searched every corner of town, questioned anyone who might know where his sister had gone. His obsession was consuming him. He couldn't let Rachel escape, couldn't let her live her life without paying for the betrayal. It was a matter of control, a matter of proving that no one could defy him and get away with it. His need for vengeance was so all-consuming that it clouded his judgment. He had become erratic, unpredictable, and now, with Rachel slipping through his fingers, his anger turned inward. He was losing everything he had fought so hard for. His grip on Sophia was weakening, and without Rachel, he was nothing. One evening, he stood in front of the mirror, his eyes wild, his thoughts spiraling. The man he had been calm, controlled, ruthless was fading. In his place stood a man desperate to reclaim what he had lost, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. "I'll make them both pay," he muttered to himself, clenching his fists. "I'll make them both regret this." The next day, Jamal's plan began to take shape. He knew he couldn't take on Rachel alone. She had too many people watching her. But Sophia was still under his thumb, still loyal to him. Or so he thought. He would use that to his advantage. He called her again. "Sophia, I need to see you," he said, his voice cold. "We need to talk." Sophia hesitated, fear seizing her chest. She knew exactly what Jamal wanted. "I told you, Jamal, I'm not going back to that house. I'm not helping you hurt Rachel." His voice lowered, a dangerous edge creeping in. "You'll help me, Sophia. You don't have a choice." Sophia's stomach churned, but she stood firm. "No, I won't. Not anymore." For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then Jamal spoke, his tone quieter, but no less menacing. "We'll see about that," he said softly before hanging up. Sophia knew she had to act fast. Jamal was getting more dangerous by the day, and now she realized she had to protect herself, protect Rachel, and finally break free from his grip before it was too late. Rachel had never been one to run, but as the days turned into weeks, the constant fear gnawing at her insides became too much to ignore. It wasn't just Jamal that haunted her. It was the uncertainty, the helplessness of never knowing when he would show up or how he would find her next. The quiet moments she'd once cherished now felt suffocating, each one filled with the awareness that she was being hunted. But despite the fear, Rachel knew something had to change. She couldn't keep running forever. She needed to take control of her life, finally face the demons that had controlled her for so long. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed Sophia. The sisters hadn't spoken much in the past few weeks. There had been the phone calls, the occasional message, but nothing more. Sophia had been careful, almost too careful, keeping a distance. Rachel didn't know if it was because Sophia had been too afraid of Jamal or because she was unsure of where her loyalties lay. It didn't matter. The time for hesitation was over. Rachel needed Sophia's help now. Whether Sophia was ready for it or not, she reached out again. This time, Rachel knew the risks of contacting her sister, but she couldn't do this without her. The call went through, and after a moment of hesitation, Sophia answered. "Rachel." Her voice was soft, but Rachel could hear the tension beneath it. "What's going on?" "I need you, Sophia." Rachel's voice cracked as she spoke. "I can't keep hiding. I can't keep running. Jamal's going to destroy everything, and I don't know how much longer I can take it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Rachel could practically hear the wheels turning in Sophia's head. Finally, Sophia spoke, her tone resigned. "I know. I've been watching him. I don't know what he's planning, but I can feel it getting worse. I think it's time we take him down. Together." Rachel felt a surge of relief wash over her. "What do we do? How do we stop him?" Sophia hesitated, her voice shaky when she spoke again. "We have to confront him, Rachel. We can't keep running. We need to make him understand that we're not afraid anymore." Rachel's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. She was terrified, but for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. Hope that they could finally break free of Jamal's control. The sisters arranged to meet in a secluded park on the outskirts of town. It was a place where they had played as children, a place that used to be filled with laughter and light. But now it was just an empty patch of grass, the shadows creeping longer as the sun began to set. It felt symbolic. Rachel thought. A place where they would put the past behind them. Sophia arrived first, looking over her shoulder nervously as she walked toward the bench where Rachel had been waiting. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a determination in her step. She had made a choice. Rachel stood up as Sophia approached, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Rachel spoke. "We can't let him control us anymore. We can't keep letting him ruin our lives." Sophia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but we can't just confront him head on, Rachel. We have to be smart. He's dangerous." Rachel clenched her fists, a wave of anger rising within her. "I don't care how dangerous he is. He's not going to keep hurting us." The sisters walked together, talking quietly as they formulated their plan. They needed leverage. They needed something that would force Jamal to back down once and for all. They knew Jamal had secrets that could destroy him if they were exposed. They just needed to find them. By the time night fell, they had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was their only option. They would use Jamal's obsession with control against him, baiting him into a confrontation that would expose his lies, his manipulation, and his cruel schemes. They would put an end to it all. As they parted ways that night, neither of them spoke much. There was a weight in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that they were on the brink of something big, something that could change everything. And despite the fear, despite the danger, they were both ready. The following days felt like a blur. Jamal had become more erratic, more desperate. His obsession with Rachel and Sophia was growing, and he began to make reckless decisions, hiring people to follow them, making threats against their friends. But the sisters were ready. They had played the game long enough. Now it was time to turn the tables. On the day of the confrontation, they met at the park once again, this time with a recording device hidden in Sophia's bag. They needed evidence. They needed something to show the world what Jamal had done, what he had been hiding all these years. Jamal arrived, his face twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists. He had never looked more dangerous. He stood before them, his voice low and cold. "You think you can run from me? You think you can hide? You don't know what I'm capable of." Rachel stood tall, meeting his gaze. "We're not running anymore, Jamal. We're not scared of you." His eyes flickered with disbelief, then shifted to fury. "You think you can destroy me? You're nothing. You're nothing without me." The tension crackled in the air as Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're everything with each other. And you're nothing without your lies." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm lying? You think I've been hiding something?" Sophia stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "We know everything, Jamal. We know what you've done. And we're going to make sure everyone knows, too." Jamal laughed bitterly. "You think I'm scared of your threats? You think you can destroy me with words?" Rachel didn't respond. Instead, she pressed the button on the recorder, capturing his words as proof. The truth was finally out, and there was no turning back. Jamal's face went pale as he realized what they had done. His fists clenched again, and he took a step forward. But Rachel and Sophia were ready. They had planned for this. The authorities were already on their way. Jamal's reign of terror was over. It was a slow burn, the days that followed. Jamal was arrested, his secrets exposed for the world to see. The sisters had finally broken free from his grip. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew they had done the right thing. They were no longer victims. They were survivors. The park where they had met, where they had planned their final stand, became a symbol of their new beginning, a place where they could finally be free. As the sisters walked away from the courthouse, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with understanding. They had taken back their lives, and nothing could take that away from them. The days after Jamal's arrest were nothing like the sisters had imagined. They had hoped for relief, for peace, but instead there was only the weight of what had happened and what it meant for their futures. They had exposed Jamal, but his influence still lingered, and so did the consequences of the choices they had made. Rachel hadn't expected to feel so lost. She had spent years trying to escape Jamal's grasp, but now, even with him behind bars, the emptiness remained. The trauma, the fear, it wasn't something that disappeared with his capture. It wasn't something that could be easily erased. She found herself lying awake at night, the silence in her room louder than anything she had ever known. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now felt even more isolating. The walls seemed to close in on her as memories of her brother's cruelty resurfaced, haunting her when she was alone with her thoughts. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed to be taking the news better. She was practical, always had been. She worked hard to take care of the logistics, arranging meetings with lawyers, making sure their lives were put back together as best as they could be. But even Sophia was hiding something. There was a nervous energy about her that Rachel couldn't ignore. She hadn't been the same since the confrontation with Jamal, as if she were carrying a secret she wasn't ready to share. One evening, as the sisters sat at the kitchen table in the dim light of the overhead lamp, Rachel decided to confront her. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Rachel couldn't wait any longer. "Sophia," she began softly, not wanting to push too hard, "what's really going on? You've been acting strange. I know something's bothering you." Sophia froze, her hand pausing in the middle of stirring her tea. For a moment she didn't speak, but Rachel could see the tension in her shoulders. She could feel the walls Sophia had put up around herself, but Rachel refused to back down this time. "I'm not going to let you shut me out, not after everything we've been through," Rachel added. "We're in this together, remember?" Sophia set her cup down with a sigh, her eyes avoiding Rachel's for a moment. Then she finally spoke, her voice heavy with a mix of guilt and hesitation. "It's about what we did, about Jamal. There's something I didn't tell you." Rachel leaned in, feeling her stomach tighten with dread. "What do you mean? What didn't you tell me?" Sophia glanced at Rachel, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I didn't just help you confront Jamal because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought we could expose him, yes, but I also thought I could use the situation to our advantage." Rachel blinked, not understanding. "What are you talking about? Use it to our advantage?" Sophia's voice wavered as she spoke, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. "I knew that if Jamal went down, there was a chance to get everything he had worked for, his money, his assets, and I thought we could use it to secure our future. But now I realize I've gone too far. It was selfish, and I shouldn't have done it." Rachel's heart sank. You were going to take advantage of this? You didn't tell me because you thought I wouldn't agree?" Sophia lowered her head, unable to look her sister in the eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you." "Rachel, I didn't want to put you in that position. But now I see how wrong it was. I was trying to control things again, like Jamal did, but I should have trusted you. We should have stuck together, not been tempted by revenge or greed. Rachel's mind raced as the weight of Sophia's words hit her. She had always seen Sophia as the steady one, the one who held it together when everything else was falling apart. But this was a side of her sister that Rachel had never known, a side she wasn't sure how to handle. "I don't know what to say," Rachel murmured, her voice filled with a mix of hurt and disbelief. "I thought you were just trying to help me, but now I don't know if I can trust you." Sophia reached out, her hand shaking as she placed it on Rachel's. "Please, Rachel, don't let this tear us apart. I made a mistake, and I regret it. I didn't know how to cope. I was scared of losing everything, of being left with nothing after all we went through." Rachel stared at her sister, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was the realization that Sophia, too, had been hurt by Jamal's actions in ways Rachel hadn't understood. She had been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't seen the depth of Sophia's struggle. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," Rachel said quietly, her voice breaking, "but I'm not going to let you go." "Not like this," Sophia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Rachel. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you." The two sisters sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, but at least now she understood why Sophia had acted the way she did. They were both victims in different ways, both struggling to find their place in a world that had constantly tried to tear them down. And despite the betrayal, despite the lies, Rachel knew that Sophia was still her sister. That bond, however strained, was something they couldn't easily break. But it would take time to heal, to rebuild, to find their way back to each other. The following days brought a sense of cautious optimism. There were moments of laughter between Rachel and Sophia, fleeting glimpses of the closeness they had once shared. But there was also a distance between them, an awareness that things couldn't go back to the way they had been. Not yet. They knew there was still work to do. Jamal's arrest was only the beginning. And now they had to figure out how to rebuild their lives from the rubble he had left behind. There was no blueprint for how to heal from the years of control and manipulation, no guide for how to move forward when everything had been shattered. But Rachel and Sophia had something Jamal never could, the strength to face the future together. And no matter how long it took, they were willing to fight for it. The days grew longer as Rachel and Sophia continued their journey of rebuilding. The weight of their past never truly left them. It lingered in every conversation, in every look they exchanged, and in the quiet moments when the world seemed too loud. They had been through so much betrayal, control, manipulation, but they were still here, together, fighting for something better. Sophia had taken on more responsibilities. She worked with a lawyer to get their finances in order, and they began selling the old family house, the one that had been tainted by Jamal's actions. It felt like the right thing to do, a step toward cleansing their lives from the horrors of their past. Yet, despite the progress, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The past had a way of clawing at her, reminding her that nothing was ever truly as it seemed. One evening, after a long day of paperwork and phone calls, The sisters sat together on the back porch of their new apartment. The setting sun cast a soft orange glow across the yard, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt a flicker of peace. But that peace was fragile, and she knew it. Sophia sat next to her, a little too quiet, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. Rachel could tell there was something more on her mind, something she hadn't yet shared. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked, her voice low but insistent. Sophia sighed, her shoulders slumping as she leaned back in her chair. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I had everything figured out, but there's still so much I haven't told you." Rachel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What haven't you told me?" Sophia hesitated before speaking, her eyes focused on the fading light. "It's about Jamal, about how he always had everything under control. We thought we were living on his terms, but he was playing a much bigger game." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had been thinking the same thing. Despite Jamal's arrest, there was still a sense that his influence was still alive in ways they didn't fully understand. Sophia's words seemed to confirm it. "I don't get it," Rachel said. "I thought we were done with him. He's in jail, his schemes exposed. What more could there be?" Sophia turned to face her, her expression grave. Jamal wasn't just running the adoption scams. He was involved in a much larger network. There were people in high places, people he worked with, people who would go to any length to protect their interests. And now that he's in jail, they might come after us. Rachel's stomach churned. "Are you saying that there's a bigger conspiracy? That we're not safe?" Sophia nodded slowly. "I'm not sure, but I've seen the signs. The way some people have been acting, the way things were handled after Jamal's arrest, it's all too calculated. We may have been free from Jamal, but we're not free from the world he was connected to." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the realization that their lives were far from normal. Rachel had always felt the undercurrent of something wrong, something beyond their control, but hearing it confirmed by Sophia made it all too real. "I need to know everything, Sophia," Rachel said, her voice steady. "We can't afford to be in the dark anymore. If there's a threat, we need to face it head on. We need to understand who we're dealing with." Sophia hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I've been doing some digging, looking into Jamal's past. It's not easy, but I've uncovered a few things. His connections, his dealings. He wasn't just a petty criminal. He was a key player in something much bigger." Rachel's heart raced. "Tell me everything." Sophia took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. Jamal had contacts in the adoption industry, yes, but he also had ties to wealthy families who wanted children, families who didn't care about the moral implications of what Jamal was doing, as long as they got what they wanted. Some of these families were connected to powerful people, people who had the means to make things disappear. And Jamal's arrest? It might have just been a sacrifice to cover up something far more sinister. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. "Are you saying that our whole lives, everything we've been through, were part of something bigger? That we were just pawns in some twisted game?" Sophia nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The implications of her words were suffocating. Rachel had always known that Jamal's actions were evil, but now she was realizing just how deep his involvement had gone. They had been trapped in a web of corruption and manipulation, with no way of knowing who was pulling the strings. Sophia stood up suddenly, her movements sharp. "We need to act fast. We can't just sit here and wait for something to happen. We have to take control of the situation before it controls us." Rachel stood too, her mind racing. "What do we do?" "We need to expose everything," Sophia said, determination in her voice. "We have to go after those who are still out there, the ones who were in on it with Jamal. We can't let them keep running things like nothing happened." Rachel nodded slowly, her hands clenched into fists. The fear was still there, gnawing at her insides, but there was something else, now something sharper. A sense of purpose. They had been victims for too long, but now they were ready to fight. Sophia grabbed her bag, pulling out a stack of papers. "I've been compiling everything I've found. Names, dates, connections. It's not enough yet, but it's a start." Rachel took the papers from her sister, scanning the names and numbers written on the sheets. They were just pieces of a puzzle, but they were pieces that could finally lead to the truth. "We'll get them," Rachel said, her voice steady and sure. "We'll make them pay for everything they've done." And in that moment, something changed. The sisters weren't just survivors anymore, they were fighters. They would face whatever came next, no matter how dangerous, no matter how dark. They were no longer afraid. They were ready for the battle. The tension that had built up over the past weeks reached its peak. The sun was just beginning to set as Rachel and Sophia worked late into the night, mapping out their next steps. The papers spread out across the kitchen table felt heavy in Rachel's hands. She knew that this was their last chance to bring everything to light. If they failed now, the world they had been fighting to build would crumble. There was no going back. Sophia was on the phone with a private investigator she had hired to dig deeper into Jamal's connections. The silence in the room was suffocating as Rachel watched her sister pace, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. Each phone call, each new piece of information, felt like it was pushing them closer to the edge. The darkness that had surrounded their family was now a tangible presence waiting to swallow them whole. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about what Sophia had uncovered, names of people, powerful people who had been part of Jamal's scheme. She had heard of some of them before, but others were completely new. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. They were no longer just fighting against Jamal. They were up against a system, an entire network of individuals who had been exploiting vulnerable women and children for years. The sound of Sophia's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're in. He has the information. We can move forward." Rachel didn't need to ask who he was. It was the private investigator, the one who had promised to expose the connections between Jamal and the wealthy families who had been complicit in his actions. This was the moment they had been waiting for. With this final piece of the puzzle, they would have the evidence they needed to take down everyone involved. Sophia hung up the phone and turned to Rachel. Her face was grim, but there was a fire in her eyes that Rachel hadn't seen before. "We're doing this tonight." Rachel nodded. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she knew there was no turning back now. "Let's do it." The two sisters set their plan into motion, gathering the documents and preparing to meet the investigator in a secluded area of town. The meeting place was chosen carefully away from prying eyes, away from the people who might be watching their every move. It was risky, but it was their only option. As they drove to the meeting, Rachel's mind raced. Everything had led to this. The manipulation, the lies, the control. They had been pawns in Jamal's game for far too long. But now they were taking back their lives. When they arrived at the meeting spot, the investigator was already there, waiting in his car. His face was shadowed, but Rachel could see the weight of the information he carried in his hands. He motioned for them to approach, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he spoke. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Rachel looked at Sophia, who gave a firm nod. "We have to, for our future, for the truth." The investigator handed them a folder, thick with documents. Rachel's fingers trembled as she opened it, scanning the papers. It was all there, the names, the dates, the connections, everything they needed to expose the people who had been pulling the strings behind Jamal's schemes. It was overwhelming, but it was the truth, and it was theirs to wield. "This is it," the investigator said. "You can go public with this. It will shake the system to its core. But be careful. These people won't go down easily." Rachel looked up at him, determination burning in her eyes. "We're ready." With the folder in hand, they left the meeting and returned to their apartment. The final steps were clear. They would leak the information to the media, ensuring that it would reach the right people, the authorities, the journalists, anyone who could help bring these criminals to justice. But as they sat in the quiet of their apartment, the doorbell rang, breaking the silence. It was late, and neither of them expected anyone. Sophia stood walking cautiously to the door. She peered through the peephole and froze. "Who is it?" Rachel asked, standing up. Sophia didn't answer right away. She was staring at the door, her face pale. Slowly she turned the handle and opened it, revealing a figure Rachel hadn't expected to see. It was Jamal. He was standing there, looking battered and broken. His face was bruised, and his clothes were torn, as if he had been through hell. But his eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with control and manipulation, were now filled with something else, desperation. "What are you doing here?" Sophia demanded, stepping back. "You're supposed to be in jail." Jamal's voice was hoarse, strained. "I need your help," he said, his words barely a whisper. Rachel felt her blood run cold. "Help? After everything you've done?" He nodded, his face contorting with emotion. "They're after me, the people I worked with. They've found me. They know what I've been trying to do, and they want to silence me. They'll do worse to you, to both of you, if you don't help me." Sophia stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Why should we trust you? You've ruined our lives." Jamal's eyes filled with tears, but there was a coldness in his voice that Rachel didn't miss. "Because I know the truth about everything. You think you have all the answers, but you don't. There's more to this than you realize." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment where everything could go horribly wrong. Jamal was back, but was he telling the truth? Or was he playing one last game, trying to manipulate them into saving him? "Tell us everything," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "Tell us what you know." Jamal stepped inside, his presence heavy. "I'll tell you everything. But you have to promise me something. You have to promise me that you'll protect yourselves. The people I was involved with, they won't stop. They'll do anything to get what they want." Sophia and Rachel exchanged a look. They were in too deep now. There was no turning back. Jamal took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the final piece of the puzzle, the truth that would change everything.